On the evening of December 27, 1979, a specialized Soviet strike force moved through the darkness toward an imposing silhouette on the outskirts of Kabul. Within 43 minutes, they would execute a raid that ended a presidency and began a decade of war. Their objective was the assassination of Afghan President Hafizullah Amin, the centerpiece of a plan to force a total regime change. Amin's headquarters, the Tajbeg Palace, sat atop a steep hill, protected by minefields and 3 dug-in T-54 tanks. It was designed to be nearly impossible to take by storm. Roughly 2,500 Afghan troops guarded the palace grounds. To overcome them, the Soviet command did not send a division. They sent an assault force of just 560 men. The first component was the GRU's Muslim Battalion. These soldiers were recruited from Central Asian republics and wore local uniforms to blend in with the Afghan military they were preparing to betray. They were joined by KGB special teams Zenit and Grom, along with elite Spetsnaz paratroopers. The kinetic plan relied on speed. Battle Group 1 neutralized and placed tanks. Simultaneously, Battle Group 2 launched a frontal assault in armored vehicles up the main road. Battle Group 3 flanked from the west, covered by Shilka anti-aircraft guns. While the assault force moved on the palace, a layer of citywide disinformation and sabotage paralyzed the rest of the Afghan military. Soviet military advisors, already embedded in Afghan units, secretly removed the batteries from local tanks under the pretense of routine maintenance. At the same time, KGB agents crippled Kabul's central telephone network, cutting the palace off from the outside world. This fusion of subversion, sabotage, and direct action would eventually become a permanent part of the curriculum at Russian airborne academies. On paper, Operation Storm 333 was a flawless tactical triumph. In reality, it committed the Soviet Union to a political crisis they were not prepared to solve. In the early 1970s, Afghanistan was a relatively stable, developing state, balancing its role as a crossroads between Cold War powers. American and Soviet advisors worked on competing infrastructure projects. They lived in lavish apartments, often staying in the country for years at a time. That stability ended in 1973, when Mohammad Dawood Khan seized power in an army-backed coup, abolishing the monarchy. Dawood ruled as a strongman, but his military purges and the silencing of political opposition quickly alienated the country's Islamist factions. Facing imprisonment or execution, thousands of Afghan Islamists fled across the border into Pakistan. Pakistan's intelligence agency, the ISI, provided these exiles with training and equipment, hoping to create a permanent source of pressure against the government in Kabul. In April 1978, Communist Army officers assassinated Dawood during the Sour Revolution, placing the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, or PDPA, in control. The new regime was paralyzed by factional infighting. Hardliners like Taraki and Amin purged moderates like Babrak Karmal, while the external insurgent threat grew. The hardliners launched a radical modernization program, using force to implement land expropriations in a traditional rural society. This was coupled with a violent campaign against the clergy, which the PDPA characterized as feudalists holding back progress. Rural uprisings followed, resulting in army mutinies and thousands of deaths. By 1979, the government lost control of most of the countryside. With its communist ally on the verge of collapse, Moscow faced a choice: abandon the regime or initiate a full-scale military occupation. Moscow was initially hesitant. Throughout 1979, the Politburo repeatedly denied Kabul's requests for direct Soviet troop deployments to put down the growing insurgency. The tipping point came in September, when Hafizullah Amin had his rival Taraki murdered and seized total control of the party. The KGB, suspicious of Amin's past studies in the U.S., incorrectly concluded he was a CIA asset preparing to shift Afghanistan into the American sphere. Inside the Politburo, a clash developed between political reality and military confidence. KGB head Yuri Andropov and Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko warned that an invasion would alienate the Muslim world and end the era of global détente. Military leadership pushed back, citing the success of previous Soviet interventions. They believed the PDPA could function as a vanguard party, assuming a brief show of force, modeled on Czechoslovakia and Angola, would stabilize the government. The strategic goal of the wider invasion was to remove Amin and install the moderate Babrak Karmal, who they believed could reunify the warring factions. The 40th Army advanced through the passes of the Hindu Kush, entering a landscape much more difficult to pacify than the generals anticipated. Moscow accepted the political costs of the invasion, assuming that a surgical regime change could stabilize an Afghan government that had lost control of its own army and territory. The military's 6-month timeline failed almost immediately. The invasion drove 430,000 refugees into Pakistan within weeks, creating a humanitarian and political crisis for the region. The presence of Soviet troops supercharged the insurgency, allowing the Mujahideen to frame themselves as defenders of Islam against a foreign invader. In Washington, President Jimmy Carter condemned the invasion and warned that Soviet expansionism must be stopped. National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski saw an opportunity to trap the Soviet Union in its own version of the Vietnam War by providing massive support to the rebels. This strategic pivot flooded capital and weapons into Pakistan's ISI, the Central Resistance Hub. To maintain this, the U.S. ignored Pakistan's pursuit of nuclear weapons, prioritizing Soviet defeat. Saudi Arabia matched American funding dollar for dollar, vastly increasing the Mujahideen's capabilities. Diplomatically, the Soviet Union was isolated. The UN General Assembly overwhelmingly condemned the invasion, with many non-aligned nations viewing Moscow as an imperial power. By 1980, the Soviets were trapped. They were locked into an unwinnable proxy war against an insurgency that now had virtually unlimited international support. Operation Storm 333 demonstrates the limits of tactical success. By attempting to solve a local political crisis through a decapitation strike, Moscow instead created an internationally funded proxy war that lasted 10 years.